We're going to cover a lot of things today. We're going to cover the gear. We're going to cover the different types of rigs, the presentation, spinners, no spinners, different style of hooks. We're going to cover how you move your boat, what speed you move your boat, all the little nuances you can do to trigger bites instead of just aimlessly trolling a big chunk of water.
Oh my goodness.
Freaking giant walleye. So stay tuned for that. This is an extremely effective thing to learn how to do. What is up, fisher people? So my goal today in this video is to make sure that after the next 25 minutes, you're gonna know more than 90% of every other angler about trolling bottom bouncers for walleyes. How does that sound? It's fair to say that I have some experience trolling bottom bouncers, considering the fact that as a fishing guide, that is a very large part of what I do to put fish in the boat for a very large part of the season. And what better place to do it, a video like this, than on the great Lake Sakakawea, the birthplace of the bottom bouncer. For those that may not have known that information, a fellow by the name of Bob Meter invented it here, I think sometime in the 1970s, because as you can imagine, when they first flooded this reservoir, there was a lot of garbage and debris in the water. Ooh, quick break. Bottom bouncer storage tip. At that point, they were pulling a lot of Lindy rigs. They were dragging a lot of jigs around. And you can imagine how those things could get snagged in certain areas when there's a lot of rock, rubble, trees, grass, whatever, all kinds of stuff on the bottom of the lake. So the idea was to find a presentation that would bounce along the bottom, keep the bait up off the bottom to keep it out of the snags. But as it turns out, it's also just a very effective way to trigger walleyes into biting, because sometimes instead of the bait dragging on the bottom, the walleyes like it up a little bit. They like to feed up as opposed to straight down on the bottom of the lake. And that's one thing we're going to get into later, is leader length and how high you're riding that presentation in the water to change the bites depending on the mood of the fish. So stay tuned for that. In fact, Bob Meter is in the North Dakota Hall of Fame and has a plaque here in Garrison, North Dakota at North Country Marine, which is a fantastic boat dealership and service shop. If there's anything you need for your boat while you're in town, great place to go. And like I said, as a guide, I do this a ton. And when I grew up walleye fishing with my dad, I thought bottom bouncer trolling was walleye fishing. Like, I had messed around with other lures and the jigs and stuff and caught a few walleyes at local lakes. But when he took me out to the Missouri River reservoir system and we started trolling bottom bouncers, I was like, oh my gosh, this is real walleye fishing. Now, obviously, there's a lot of other things you can do. Casting's becoming a lot more popular. I've gotten way into casting for fish. Forward-facing sonars changed the game with that a lot. But if you just want to get started and catch fish, or even if you're fishing some of these systems and fish are spread out and you need to keep moving to get through fish, I can't think of a better way to do it other than crankbait trolling. But if they're not on the crankbait and they're on the live bait bite, or you want something a little more interactive, that's not just a rod in the rod holder kind of thing, the bottom bouncers just catch so many walleyes. They're so effective. They're so universally applicable to any lake that you fish walleyes, pretty much. So with that in mind, we're going to cover a lot of things today. We're going to cover the gear. We're going to cover the different types of rigs, the presentation, spinners, no spinners, different style of hooks. We're going to cover how you move your boat, what speed you move your boat, how you work different depths, all the little nuances you can do to trigger bites instead of just aimlessly trolling a big chunk of water and hoping for a bite, okay? We'll get to all that stuff in due time. Let's cover the gear first, because people love to talk about gear. And to be fair, it is somewhat important. But since we're gearing up, we are going to bait up a couple of hooks. Like with a lot of things, there's a lot of right ways you can do it, and there's definitely wrong ways. The most important thing is when you're putting a night crawler on a bottom bouncer, and you control other baits, you can do minnows, stuff like that. This is typically used, especially for me, as a summer presentation, even though this looks nothing like summer. We got a massive cold front, hence cold weather gear, but we're going to use crawlers. It is crawler season. It is July 16th, I think. So they're on the crawler bite. Now, if you're going to hook these crawlers, the most important thing is you need this crawler long flowy in the water. You can't ball it up on a hook. You're not catfishing. There's a couple different hooks. So one hook that I'm using today is a slow death hook. So slow death hooks have this bend in the wire, which allows the bait to have this corkscrew presentation. You can also create that with a non-slow death hook anyway, but some people use slow death hooks because it makes it more effective. But if you're going to use this slow death hook, you have to thread these night crawlers on there. It won't work if it's not threaded on. So you thread it as far as you can get it, pull it up over the eyelet to get it more secure. And now when you put that thing in the water, inevitably that thing is going to corkscrew in the water as it goes. Once you get trolling, as you drop the line in, you want to make sure it's doing this. If it's not doing this, you might as well be using a different hook. I'm also going to get my other hook to do the same thing. So that's a slow death hook. The other one I like to use for these rigs is what's called an octopus hook, which I have over here. If you do the same thing and you thread the night crawler onto that hook, pull it over the eyelet, it's going to have a similar spinning action. But just don't ball it up. I know some people like to wacky rig the things and give it like a twister tail effect. That can work. That's not the standard thing that I do, but I'm not going to poo-poo that idea. But you need some crawler hanging off. You can't ball up the bait. You're not trolling a ball of night crawler chum for walleyes. So in terms of the rods, I like to use a fairly long rod, and the reason being is I like the fish to be able to kind of load that rod up a lot before it realizes what's going on. The longer your rod is, the more ability you give it to allow some load before the fish is really on there. This is a 7-foot rod. My other ones are 6.5 because they fit in my rod locker better when I got a lot of rods in there, but I think a 7-foot, even a 7.5 is a really good idea. And you don't want too stiff of a rod or too fast action of a rod. You want something with more of a kind of a medium or a moderate action kind of thing, a medium or a medium light rod, because your goal is to allow a lot of load when the fish takes. That's the main thing that you want. If it's too stiff, they're going to start grabbing it and pulling it and realize something's happening, and they're going to spit it. If they don't feel all that load, they chump up that night crawler, you start to get a bite, and then that fish is just on. They have no idea. Oftentimes they hook themselves if you got it in a rod holder, and you don't have to do any work. Let's finish this gear discussion. I also like to use these bait casting reels for me because it just basically allows you to, as you're moving different depths, quick click it, let out some line. So it's very easy for line adjustments. There's nothing wrong with a spinning reel, but when you open a spinning reel bail, it's harder to regulate that. You might get some bird nest action going on. So I just like to use these bait casters. And I also like these low profile. So like some of these bait caster reels are really big. This is a nice low profile. So if you're hand-to-hand combating and you're just holding the reel, it fits in your hand real nice. So I like the low profile stuff. Here's another handy tip too for your night crawler storage. You get your crawlers in here. You got ice down here, keep them nice and cool. Link in the description. But when it comes to bottom bouncers, so the general rule of thumb is you want about an ounce of weight for every 10 feet of depth that you're fishing. That's not a super hard and fast thing, but you definitely don't want to be fishing. Oh, ripped it out of his mouth. You definitely don't want to be fishing a super light bottom bouncer in deep water and having a ton of line out. Your main goal is you want about a 45-degree line angle to just be able to touch the bottom. And that rule of thumb kind of accomplishes that. I do really like 1.5 ounce bottom bouncers, and I will try to fish those in a lot of different situations. It's also kind of sucks if you're holding the rod, if you got a 3 ounce bottom bouncer in your hand fishing deep water. It's a little clunky and cumbersome. It gets a little sore on the wrist by the end of the day. So if you can get away with a 1.5 in 25, 30 feet of water, that'll work. Another thing to note, if you got a lot of people in the boat, which I do a lot guiding, you want to spread out your weights appropriately so people don't get tangled. You want heavier bouncers in the front, lighter in the back. That'll keep these baits coming more straight down, the other baits more further back, less likely to get tangled up. So again, you know, the 1 ounce to every 10 feet of water kind of rule of thumb is a starting point, but you might make adjustments like that to make your life easier. Oh, and another bonus tip too. There are bottom bouncers where if you want to adjust weights quickly, there's like little snap-on systems and things like that. But what I basically started doing is just putting these quick lock snaps to hook the bottom bouncer. So if I want to change the bottom bouncer, I just snap it in and out. I don't have to retie it. So that's another good way. Because sometimes, again, that line angle can be super important. So even if a 1 ounce bottom bouncer is getting to the bottom, but it's a mile behind the boat, there's something about the way that presentation looks that might not catch as many fish as if you got a better, more straight down line angle. And sometimes even having a super heavy one and keep it in almost vertical works really well. So you can play with that a little bit on your line angle to see what the fish like and don't like. Now, when it comes to the line, I use braided line as my main line a lot, mostly because you can feel a lot of stuff really well, like everything else with braid. But also, if for some reason you get a snag and you're trying to get out of that snag, you're more likely to have your leader break instead of your bottom bouncer, and it's just less work to retie. When it comes to the leader itself, I prefer to use monofilament. I don't like fluorocarbon because it sinks too much, which defeats the purpose of what you're trying to do. So your bottom bouncer's here and your line's here, and if that line's sinking, you're still dragging through the bottom like a Lindy anyway. The mono's got a little more floatability. It'll get the bait up a little better, keep it off the bottom a little bit, which is kind of the goal. Yes, a bottom bouncer is meant to bounce on the bottom, but you don't want to drag things on the bottom. And that's again why that line angle comes into play. If you get too much line back and you're just, dredging your bottom bouncer on the bottom, that's not what this is. Just use a Lindy rig in that situation. But since I'm using mono, I want it to be somewhat abrasion resistant for snags when it's striking on rocks, trees, if you get big pike, other toothy fish, even the walleyes themselves. So normally I would use fluorocarbon for that, but since I want to use mono, I just go heavier. I use a 12, 14 pound monofilament test for the leader line. Then it'll be fairly strong and kind of prevent that problem. Now, we talked about the hooks a little bit already. Your slow death hook, your octopus hooks. You can use an Aberdeen hook a little bit if you want. I don't like it because it doesn't have as much action. But your next question is, do you want a plain hook, which can work very well, especially early season, or do you want some kind of a spinner for extra attraction? Now, the spinner has visual attraction. It also has vibrational attraction, which the walleyes feel with their lateral line. The spinners that I got out right now, I'm currently using what are called Max Smiley blades, which is basically a little propeller looking thing. Now there's actually straight prop blades, and then these Max blades have just a little bit of curvature to the blade, so it's kind of angled down like a triangle, which adds a little different spin to it. Then of course you got your Colorado blades and your Indiana blades, and there's a ton of different blades, but the two things to think about with the blades before the color are how the shape and spin affects the lift of the bait. The more pull that it has, like if you have a really big round Colorado blade, it's going to have more liftability. It's going to get the bait up higher, and it's also going to throw more vibration. So if you want to attract fish with vibration, if they're really hot and you're trying to pull them in, more is better. Sometimes that's too much if the fish are a little finicky. I try to downsize. These Max Smiley blades don't have a ton of vibration, just a little bit. So it's a little more subtle. Use it a little more early season, colder days, cold front, that kind of thing if I'm not using a plain hook. And then when it comes to color, there's a few different things to think about. One is, what depth can fish see certain colors? The deeper you get, the more you want to favor the cool colors on the color spectrum, like the blues. The shallower it is, the easier they can see warm colors like red. So you got to think about what they can actually see. But then in terms of what colors to actually use, sometimes things have to do with, cloudy, sunny days. So if it's a sunny day, I like to use something kind of flashy. A hammered silver Colorado blade throws off a lot of flash. These Max blades have a little bit, they got some sparkle to them, that kind of stuff. If you have some stained water, if you got some muddy water, those metallic colors are really good too, to give a little extra glow so that the fish can see it and pick it up. But then you want to think about sort of matching the hatch, think what's in the system. So in our case, we got a lot of rainbow smelt. Rainbow smelt are kind of a pearl silvery color. So I used a lot of silver blades, which might seem weird because I'm using a night crawler. So why am I trying to match a smelt? Well, I think they're just kind of in tune with that. So if they see that silver, it might grab their attention, and then they see the night crawler and think, okay, I'll grab that as a snack too. But then if you're also in situations with where there's a lot of perch around, like for example, on the weed lines, there's a lot of perch that hang out in the weeds. So if I'm trolling weed lines, a lot of times I'll use a green spinner. It's got more of a perch quality to it. And then sometimes I just play with that. So these smile blades are hard to change, but if you're using a Colorado blade, you can have those quick snap clevises And if you're not getting bites, you can just cycle through different sizes and colors of blades to figure out what might work on that day. And sometimes you may not know why it worked, but if it works, it works. So now we're going to talk a little bit about setting up the spread, if you will, like setting up your line. So if you've fished bottom bouncers a bunch, a lot of the stuff that I just talked about is probably familiar in your mind already. You probably know and understand a lot of that. But when it comes to how you get the stuff in the water, how you pull it through the water, some of this stuff might be a little less commonly known. But in order to get the line down to the bottom, first of all, like that's the first thing to think about. Now, again, with these bait casters that I like to use, it's pretty easy to let out line. And since I'm guiding and I'm often dealing with people that don't know how these work, you can set the magnetics really tight on this thing so that you can free flow this and you're not going to get a backlash. So that's one handy tip, so you don't have to keep your thumb regulating the spool all the time. But eventually, boom, that thing's going to hit the bottom. There's going to be a brief moment where that stops. Now, if you were to click it shut right there, it was on the bottom, but it might not stay there because now that we're moving the boat, eventually that whole system's going to start to lift because you got drag on your weight, you got drag on your spinner. You might need a little extra right there to actually keep it on the bottom in the strike zone. And then basically as you're moving occasionally, I like to tell people just drop it back and touch that bottom once in a while just to make sure you're down there. If you're not able to do that, you probably need some more line to make sure you can drop down, take that bottom. Now, if you want to get even more advanced with this, you can play around with different rod lengths. Like you could use a 10-foot rod out back and a short rod behind, keep some more inside, some way outside. You could push it even further and use planer boards. You could send a bait way out there. That can help reduce, line tangles, but some situations, especially clear water stuff, you might want to get baits away from the boat so you don't spook fish. So having a wide spread setup can keep it away from the boat. And that might be a thing if you're fishing a clear water system, perhaps, a natural lake in Minnesota, something like that. That's not a super big deal here where I fish on Sakakawea because we don't have super clear water, but that's a good thing to know and have in your toolkit, if you will, for how to set up that spread. Another big factor, obviously, when it comes to trolling these things is considering what your speed is. Some of the speed has to do with what it takes to trigger a bite. If fish are really lethargic, they might need it going real slow before they decide to get it. Sometimes in the summer, when they're really revved up, they're in chase mode and you have to go faster to even get them to think about it and get them to react to it. But the things to consider when you're doing that are the faster you go, the more lift on your line you're going to have. So if you're going faster, you're going to need either more line, more weight, whatever it is to keep it down in the strike zone. If you're fishing shallow water, this is a very common time for shallow summertime walleyes. You can burn these things, 1.5 to almost 1.8 and get bites that way. But if you're fishing like 25, 30 feet of water, there's just almost no way you can go 1.5, 1.6 and keep those things down unless you're using really heavy weights. So you're probably going to have to go a little slower when you're fishing deeper. And a lot of times when fish are deep, they're a little more sluggish anyway, so it might help to slow things down. But sometimes it can also be effective just to vary your speed to trigger bites. So sometimes I'll on purpose speed the boat up quick and then kind of slow it down and stall it and do this kind of thing. And sometimes it's almost like pumping the rod, if you will. If you got a fish following and it quick pulls away, they might, lunge at it, or if it quick comes back in their face, they might attack it out of aggression. You can also do the same thing zigzagging spots. Sometimes if you're trolling a break line and you kind of zigzag into it and kind of bang the bank with your setup, with your bait, that can sometimes create bites if you're fishing up against a tight break line. It can also just be effective for covering water because you're zigzagging different depths. Sometimes fish are hanging right off shelves and they'll get that bait as it's coming off the shelf and the lamb bush, it kind of thing. Just try to dial in your speed, but also just sometimes changes trigger things. When you change something, if you start to make a turn, either the inside rod or the outside rod might get hit. Well, if you start turning and the inside rod gets hit, that inside rod's going slower as you start to turn. The outside rod's going faster as you start to turn because you're accelerating the rate at which that rod moves. So if they bite an outside rod on a turn, that means they want it faster. If they bite the inside rod on the turn, that means they want it slower. You always want to learn from stuff like that as you're fishing, sort of dial in your presentation throughout the day to figure out what they want. Another thing you might want to consider as we're talking about trolling speeds and approaches, now that I'm turning downwind to reset and get back to my spot, Sometimes it can matter which direction you're going. Wind or no wind, sometimes depending on the way the fish are positioned, getting them this way gets bites and this way doesn't. So you might notice that sometimes. I always kind of like to troll into the wind because it gives me a little better ability to control the boat. Downwind, you're kind of at the whim of the wind. You can only go so slow unless you turn the trolling motor backwards to kind of hold it, or you got a drift sock or something. But into the wind, you can control it better to a certain point. If it's really rough, it might be hard because those waves keep knocking your boat stationary and it's hard to keep your speed up. And as we're talking about that, I'm gonna kind of talk about now like what you're seeing on the graph and what types of spots that you're fishing to determine how you approach it and how you decide to troll it. The sun's finally coming out and I'm getting like way hot, so I'm gonna take my jacket off. Back to the old dirty fishing sweatshirt. So probably the easiest place to troll these kind of things would be on just a big flat, because then you just have fish kind of scattered around. That's why you're kind of trolling them, because they're scattered. It doesn't really matter so much what your approach is. You just kind of set the trolling motor on a course and run into the fish that you run into. But for those of you that have spent some time walleye fishing, you probably know that when you ask anybody, or when anybody asks you a question about the bite, everybody wants to know, what depth are they in, right? Now in that case, you narrow it down and zone in and figure out these fish are hanging in 22 foot off of break lines, okay? Then it can be very effective to either use your autopilot feature, now it's getting cold again, or using that contour following. Like if you got them in Coda trolling motor, they have that iPilot link system. Contour following can be a godsend sometimes. So again, being able to control your boat and stay on that contour, stay in that depth target is gonna improve your odds of catching fish because you're just in that strike zone longer. Sometimes drifting can be super effective, if for no other reason that it makes the bait look very natural in the water. So they're used to seeing something float at the rate that the water's moving. But it's also effective just as a practical matter, because when you're going forward, you're working off the narrowest part of your boat. Like I was talking about earlier, you're trying to spread rods and lines out so that you don't get tangled. If you turn the boat sideways and drift, now all of a sudden you have a lot more room to spread things out. So if you got a lot of people in your boat, if you got a wind that's drifting at the rate of speed you want to go, it's a great way to spread people out, and a very effective method for trolling not only bottom bouncers but jigs or anything else really. So now at this point, I'm just going to try to catch some fish, talk through what I'm doing, try to throw out some other little nuances. Now, I guess one thing, like if you're the type of person that likes the rod in your hand, if you're starting to get a bite, a lot of times with a moving night crawler, a walleye will kind of chomp their way up that thing. So knowing when to set the hook is a huge deal. You're going to get a few initial bites, and like I said, there's going to be a point where the rod starts to load, which means bend really hard, that fish actually has it, and they're either going to sit still or move with it, and that's your moment to set the hook. Now when you're doing it in a rod holder, again, that's why I like rods that have a lot of loadability, because you'll get a little bit of this and a little bit of this, and eventually the finisher, that last move when that fish takes that bait down, that's when they're on, and that's when you want to grab it out of the rod holder. What I always tell people to do is, there's different kind of rod holders that look different, shaped differently, but a lot of people will try to do this number and then feel for them, and at that point you've done a lot of things to potentially let that fish spit the bait. So if you know that fish is on there, with this kind of rod holder style anyway, you grab it right there and you're out in one motion. And now you got to make sure you keep that thing tight and start reeling. You can't drop it back, just like when you're jigging or anything else. Slack is death. But getting that thing in once, and you don't have to set the hook hard, especially if you're using braid. Like some people will way overset the hook on these things. If that fish is on there, you just need a good pop and keep the rod tight and start reeling to bury that hook. Every once in a while I get people that don't set the hook hard enough, and it's just kind of a little twitch. Like you got to do enough to, pierce the skin of the walleye. But if you overset it when they're already kind of on there, if anything, you might just pull the hook, break the line. Oh, I got a perch biting. I'll pull it away from that. Oh, there's a fish right there. So I moved to a different spot, and the fish weren't super easy to mark. They're just kind of little bumps on the bottom, which is kind of a common thing that you'll see after these cold fronts. But I could see them a little better even on side imaging. That's kind of how I knew they were here. And lo and behold, I dropped in lines, and like 10 seconds later, we got a wally banger ripping down a bottom bouncer. So they're tight to bottom, but still willing to feed. And you can see how well he had that rod loaded up, probably. So I waited for that rod to really bend down there. We'll just hold him like this. 15-inch eater. Waited for that rod to really load up, grab it out of the rod holder in one smooth motion, give it a little pull forward and reel in the line. There's some fish on the left side imaging. Not marking super well under the boat, although there's one under the boat now, right behind it. Two of them actually. If I look at that down imaging, I can see it's two fish, not one. Got a little fast going into the wind. I'm going to slow her back down. Trying to hit about 0.8, which is a speed I typically like in this depth of water. Like the other effective part of this bottom bouncer trolling is you just keep moving, seeing new water, seeing what's on your side scan, down scan. If you see someone side scan, you can veer one way or another, shallower or deeper, and you're just moving through fish. So you might move through 5, 6, 7 fish that don't bite, and then you get into the next group of fish that are super hungry and they attack it. So if you're on a new lake and you're trying to test waters, crank, oh, there's a bite. Feed him a little bit. There he's on. Oh, crankbait trolling can be a great way to find fish, but bottom bouncer trolling keeps you moving as well. I think he just ran really hard to start with, but about the same size. Some cookie cutter 15-inch fryers, but good bottom bouncer demonstrators. Some fish to demonstrate the effectiveness of the bottom bouncer. We got one on the octopus hook and we got one on the slow death hook. As long as you got that motion of the bait, slow death hooks are nice, but not necessarily a requirement. Also, what drew me to this spot was the fact that the wind is blowing kind of in and across it, but there's also a subtle little mud line there, which is a little hard to see since it's cloudy today, but I'm trolling right along the edge of that mud line where the fish seem to be holding. It's a great place to find fish, period, but it's also potentially a great place to find fish a little shallower. So if you're finding fish like I was in kind of 25 feet, now you get into this mud line and they're hanging in, well, there's a mark there in 19 feet. So obviously these fish are kind of taking what we're throwing down, but if that weren't the case, my typical troubleshooting checklist would be first to adjust my spinner situation or lack thereof, different size, different color, no spinner, regular hook, slow death hook. If that didn't work, I'd start messing with my boat speed, faster, slower, zigzaggy, stop and start, stall, speed up kind of stuff. And then if that doesn't work, I start adjusting leader length. Got a little guy over here, I think. About the same size, just a little different attitude. Yahtzee. I picked this day to film because it was the one day I had off of guiding in 15 days, but also it was supposed to be calm. Not so much, but good lesson in boat control. So I've been like anticipating these breaking waves. So if your boat's just, cruising through it good, you're in good shape with whatever speed you're running. If you get one of those like crashing waves that smacks the bow, that's gonna kill it. So as soon as I hear one of those, I jack it up 4 notches real quick to anticipate that slowdown and keep the speed moving. So as soon as I feel a really good crasher, I go bang, 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 4 clicks, gun it through there, and then once it seems to be holding speed, I back it off real quick. Oh, got one down here. Feels like the same size of variety we've been getting all day here so far. Actually a little smaller. He ripped it though. Aggressive little bugger. Now as I continue working this spot, and I've made, 5 passes through here now, I continue to get a better feel for where these fish are sitting. So when I run, I don't want to go downwind today because it's too fast. So I've been using the big motor to idle back. And when I do that, I go wide so I don't go over top of those fish and spook them. But I'm continuing to see fish out in that deeper water as well. So yeah, there's some in the mud line, but there's also some hanging off the break in 25 feet. So I'm gonna make a pass here through the deeper stuff. See if those fish are any different size. Maybe they bite better, maybe they bite worse. The more intimate knowledge you get of that spot as you continue to work it over and over and over again, you get a better idea of your exact approach, the lines you want to take, what little nooks and crannies or spots on the spot you want to like focus on, make sure you run through, etc. What do we have here? Perhaps another Walter, perhaps an inch longer. Yeah, I can give him another inch. Another inch on that baby. That, my friends, is a bottom bouncer walleye. Right in the mouth. Hail. Trying to get slow-mo footage of these strikes is a challenge. Or, no, don't be. I missed like 5 fish just trying to film the dump process. Oh, don't be. And you're in the camera. Maybe I just set the hook and catch them. See, this is why I hate gold eyes. Nah, I need the artsy shot. For a lot of reasons, but they'll even get in my camera.